So welcome to Brown Bag History for October 25th, 2023. Today we're talking about some of the multicultural communities that settled in Revelstoke and a bit about racism as well. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Sinixt homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. And as we talk about settlement of Revelstoke, we have to acknowledge that before people started settling here in 1885 during the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railway, there had been the Sinixt people living here for centuries. And at the time of the coming of the railway in 1885, the Cville people, or the Sinixt people, had already been included on the Cville Reservation in Washington State, and were considered by a lot of people in this area as being American Indigenous people, and their rights were not considered. Their land use of this land was not considered or taken into consideration in any way. Their newspaper accounts talk about them being American Indigenous people and coming into this country and not having any rights here. So there's really no acknowledgement of the fact that there had been a village settlement in the Big Eddy. Traditionally a Sinixt village, that there had been sites all up and down the Arrow Lakes and Columbia River that were Sinixt settlements, including in what's now Beaton and Galena Bay and Arrowhead. All through that, their rights were not taken into consideration at all. So you come up with articles like this one from the local newspaper, Kootenai Mail of April 13th, 1895, when it refers to them as dangerous Colvilles and saying that they should be interdicted in British Columbia. Means banned, so not allowed to enter British Columbia or Canada at all. And so this whole article is extremely biased against the Sinixt people. The language is really inflammatory, and it talks about how they're coming into this area. They're gathering crops that the local farmers had planted. They're shooting animals off on people's property and taking the animals away without any understanding that this had been their territory for centuries. So it just sort of went into that narrative that there hadn't been Indigenous people here, that they might have come through, but they never had territory. They never actually lived here. And that narrative actually continued even when I started working here 40 years ago. That's what was in our written history, was that there were no Indigenous people here because they didn't like the snow and they were afraid of the mountains, and we know that's just absolutely not true. But that was the narrative that was perpetuated by this kind of article, by this kind of feeling, even though there were still Indigenous people or Sinixt people like Alex Christian at Capitals, which is now in the Castlegar area, was working hard, petitioning the government to get reserve land in that area, but they were constantly ignored. You'll see notes. I've seen a note about complaining that the Sinixt people, and they always called them the Colvilles. The Colvilles had come up the river and were setting fires as they went and destroying the forests. Well, what they were doing was managing their berry crops. They were controlled burns. It was part of how they'd managed their resources for years. So it just sort of created that narrative. Finally, they just stopped coming up to Canada. It was not safe for them. There was actually a murder that happened in 1894 at Galena Bay, where a settler named Sam Hill shot a Sinixt man named Jim. And so I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of that today, but in this article in 1895 defended Sam Hill and saying that he was defending his property and that the man Jim had been maddened by the sound of his civilizing axe, is the way they referred to it in the article. So they really didn't have a chance in establishing any kind of claims in Canada with those kinds of attitudes. So we all know now that 2.5 years ago, a Supreme Court decision has affirmed that the Sinixt people are Indigenous peoples of Canada. And a nice follow-up that I just heard about this morning is that they've just opened an office in Nelson. And so they're finding ways that they can make us aware that this is their homeland and that we need to work with them and find ways to move forward and respect that. So it's just always important whenever we're talking about settlement that we don't forget who was here before the European settlers came in here. So from the 1901 census, the total population of Revelstoke at that time was 4,603, about half of what it is now. Of those, 910 were English, 626 were Scottish, 551 were Irish. There was 138 Italians, 403 Scandinavians, and that includes like mostly Sweden and Norway, a few Finnish settlers as well, and 173 French, 94 Germans, 436 Chinese. They were referred to as Asians, but going through and analyzing the census data, all of the Asians who were here at that time were Chinese. And then there were others from either given American citizenship, Canadians or other places in Canada, but hadn't given like an ethnic origin, Indigenous, Austrian, and Austrian. The Austrian Empire at that time included Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans as well, Greek, Spanish, Swiss, Dutch, and others. The interesting thing about the 1901 census is that it includes a column for skin color. And as far as I can tell, it's the only Canadian census that did that. But there's a column there. So based on those numbers, most of the columns had W for white. All of the Chinese residents were given the letter Y for yellow, because the Asian people were called yellow at that time.
Did you count the number of Indigenous R?
There were, so R was Indigenous. In this particular census, there's only about half a dozen. And actually, one of them was the daughter of William M. Brown, who was the owner of the hotel, the Columbia House Hotel on Front Street. And his daughter and her daughter were listed with the initials R because Adeline's mother was Indigenous. Oh, we can talk about it. Tell you more about that later. Yeah, and then B for Black. I don't believe there were any listed in the 1901 census for Revelstoke. So that was an official government document. So the racism was at every level. So the famous picture here of the driving of the last spike at Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885. And there's a sea of white faces there, even though we know that there was several thousand people from China who had been specifically brought over to work on the railway. And we also know that a lot of Indigenous people worked on the railway as well. But they're not represented in that photograph at all. We were given some information a while ago that a man named Wing Chung, who was a local Chinese merchant, had been present there. And it's certainly possible, but definitely didn't make it into the photograph. So this was, as you can see from that census, Revelstoke was largely settled by people from Great Britain and Ireland. So Revelstoke had a cricket club. They just revived the cricket club again last year or so, but traditionally that was the very popular British sport. So the British people who were here had a cricket club, and this was their pavilion in what's now Queen Elizabeth Park. There's right on the edge there, there's a woman with you can not quite see, but there's a baby buggy there. And the baby in the buggy was Helen Hammond, who many people will remember as a school teacher, a beloved school teacher in Revelstoke. This is the members of the Women's Canadian Club of Revelstoke, and they were part of the Returned Soldiers Welcoming Committee. So they would meet the trains during World War I and give gifts to any returning soldiers and sell flowers and fruit and candy to raise money for their war efforts. But again, all British women. And some of the early pioneers on Front Street, this man is F.B. Wells. So again, very, very much the dominant culture. The white British men were in charge of the newspapers. They were in charge of the government. So that was the viewpoint that was reflected in pretty much everything that was happening in the community. There's our first city council when Revelstoke was incorporated on March 1st, 1899. And the first council was elected on April 4th, 1899. And again, you can see all white Anglo-Saxon men. All of them have facial hair as well. When I show this picture to school kids and ask them what they notice, of course, the first thing they notice is all the mustaches and the beard and the fancy clothes. But then after we look into it a little while, they had noticed that they're all men, and sort of realized, then we talk about the fact that women were not allowed to vote even until about 18 years after this. So 1917, women got the vote in British Columbia. And the fact that they're all English or Irish names. One interesting thing, though, Florence McCarty, the first mayor of Revelstoke, was Catholic. And if he'd been back in Ontario, he probably wouldn't have been elected as mayor because especially in Ontario, it was still very much Protestant that was sort of in control of government. But, things were loosening a little bit out in the West. It was still a bit, Wild West, and some of the same rules didn't apply. So we had a Catholic as our first mayor. But he was originally Irish from, I think he was born in the States, but Irish background. So as I mentioned, a lot of Chinese people were involved in the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. There was several thousand who were brought over specifically to do the work on the western part of the line between Vancouver and Craigellachie. So they did not work east of Craigellachie because there was no way of getting them there. There was no railway to transport them. So they were coming off the ships off of Vancouver and being sent into the work field. So mostly like from Yale westward. And we know that they were paid about half of what the white workers were paid. They were housed in tents, whereas the other workers, they would usually build cabins for the white workers as they were moving them along the line. They were supposed to have been looked after in the winter and paid enough money to keep them alive during the winter, but they weren't. So there was one winter, a lot of them were in Hope and Yale, and there were men dying of scurvy, of the Chinese workers. We know that they were given a lot of the most dangerous jobs, and there's estimates of anywhere from maybe a few hundred to several thousand Chinese men who died during the construction of the railway, but we don't know that because they did not keep records. So at that time, they were required to register. All deaths were supposed to be registered with the province. And I've gone in and I found names, looking in the old newspapers, names of white workers who were working on the railway. And you can find their death certificates, but none exist for any of the Chinese workers. So we just don't know that number of the people who died. After the railway was completed, the Chinese men were supposed to have been given passage back to China if they chose to do that, but they weren't. So a lot of them ended up kind of destitute in the province. So Revelstoke did end up with a large population here. And also at that time, at the end of the railway, there was a lot of people who were very upset about all of the Chinese people being brought in. And they were concerned that it could create this sort of a huge Chinese population in British Columbia. And there was a lot of opposition to that. So the government actually did something called the Royal Commission on Chinese Immigration in 1885. And they interviewed a lot of people, only one Chinese person. He was the Chinese ambassador in San Francisco. But everybody else they interviewed was not Chinese, and they all had very biased views of the Chinese population. So on the basis of that report, the government of Canada implemented the head tax. So in 1885, it was $50. So any person entering Canada from China had to pay $50 to enter the country. That was raised to $100, and then by 1904 it was raised to $400, which was, especially given the wages they were getting at that time, would have been close to a year's wages. And that was carried on until 1923, when the government of Canada implemented the Chinese Exclusion Act, which cut off all immigration from China. And that wasn't rescinded until after the Second World War. So actually this July 1st was the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And on that day, the first Chinese Canadian museum opened in Vancouver. So after that, because a lot of the workers were trying to find places to live, there were quite a few that did settle in the area. This is a railway photograph taken in Rogers Pass in the late 1880s. So it was after the railway had been completed, but there was still a lot of ongoing work. So a lot of the Chinese workers were still hired on as laborers. And a lot of them settled in Revelstoke as well. Chinese people were definitely they were excluded from working in professions. So you couldn't be a Chinese dentist or doctor or lawyer or teacher or nurse. There were a few of the Chinese residents who did go into business. This man on the end is Chong. He owned several properties in Lower Town and in the main on Mackenzie Avenue and in the main part of town, the upper part of town. This restaurant was right about where the Chubby Funster's building is now. It was another building that was later torn down, but he owned a restaurant there. And you can see he has some Chinese cooks, but you can see that his waitresses were white women. One of them was the mother of Kay Martin, member of the Lougheed family. And in the early 1920s, the government of BC enacted legislation whereby Chinese men could not hire white women to work in the restaurants or in their businesses. They could not hire white women to work for them. And the reasoning for that was, from what I've been able to gather, is that there was a concern that there'd be intermarriage. And so that was a way to try to stop that. So it meant that these women who had good jobs lost their jobs because of that legislation. This was a man named Charlie Singh, who was really well known in the community and really well respected. He had a market garden where where the BC Hydro office is now in the industrial park. And he would drive his cart through town and sell vegetables, and kids would come and ride on his cart. He'd give them candy. Just was really well loved. It was a note in the paper when he died in 1954 saying that it was the largest attended funeral in Revelstoke up to that time. It was just really locally beloved. And I've talked quite a bit in the past about the Quang family, who came here and settled by 1907. And this photograph was taken right where the senior center is now. This was their home and laundry. The man in white is Wong Quang. The woman in the black dress is his wife, Yvonne Quang. These are their two oldest children, Sam and Jean, and then other members of extended family. They raised all of their children in Revelstoke. After Mr. Quang died, Mrs. Quang continued to keep the family going, ran the laundry, got all the kids educated. The little girl here, Jean, was the first Chinese Canadian woman to graduate as a nurse in Canada in the 1930s. So she really broke that barrier. Two of her other sisters became nurses as well. And years ago, the youngest sister told me that when the second sister graduated, she was the top student in her class, but they wouldn't give her the prize for top student because she was Chinese. They gave it to the next woman in line. So the Quang family was really well respected in town, but they did experience some discrimination as well. But for the most part, because I think people respect hard work and initiative, and the Quang certainly had that. Mrs. Quang had been, when she was born in China, she was in a fairly wealthy family, and their family had followed the tradition of binding the feet of young girls. So she raised her 9 children, worked in the laundry with disfigured feet for all of her life. This is Wing Chung and his second wife, Jung Ling. And Wing Chung was another man that, he's the one that we believe was at the driving of the last spike. He was working on railway construction and then found his way to Revelstoke, eventually started a store here, originally on Front Street, and then later had a store on First Street East, and became quite well known in the community. One of his sons became a really well-known chef in Vancouver. And that son, Sham Lai Mi, was also the first Chinese member of the BC Dragoons during the Second World War. And he rose to a rank, I think it was sergeant major in terms as a cooking instructor during the war. But he talked about how difficult it was. I actually met him, the son, years ago, and he said that it was difficult to break into that and convince people that he had the right to be part of the army. As I said, a lot of the Chinese people were restricted from doing specific jobs, but cook and housekeeper was one of the acceptable jobs. So a lot of people were hiring Chinese cooks to work for them. This was Mrs. Molson. They had the Molson. Her husband was the manager of the Molson's Bank, which at the corner of Mackenzie and First. And it's the same family that had the brewery. They also had banks. So she had a Chinese cook. She also, the very unusual photograph taken with this man, we don't know his name, but the writing on the photograph said his house. And we believe that was probably sort of somewhere in the Columbia Park area. There was mention of a lot of houses on the other side of the track. But it's quite unusual for a white woman to actually be posing with a Chinese man in a photograph like that. So this was an article from 1899, and it's Chinatown as it is, and it's actually referring to there was quite a few Chinese people and Chinese store owners on Front Street, and then there were Chinese buildings, as I said, on the other side of the track, sort of in the Columbia Park area. And they start the article by saying dirt, disease, and death. And it's talks, and they actually had the police to go into those areas, and they burned down a lot of those houses, like the house that you would have seen in that previous picture. And then they actually did a raid on the remaining buildings on Front Street, and were saying, well, there were too many people living in there. Well, that's because they burned their houses down and forced people to move into the other buildings that were there. The language is extremely, extremely racist throughout. This is a photograph taken around 1913, and it was at the Methodist Church. They actually had a Chinese school where they were teaching the English language and literacy to Chinese residents. Unfortunately, other than the name of the teacher, who was Miss McIntyre, the sister of the minister, we don't know the names of any of the people. But there's a lovely little young fellow sitting on the lap of one of the men in the middle. It's a lovely, lovely photograph. So there were definitely people in town who were helping the Chinese people and others. This was a letter from Alex McCrae, who was running for, I think he was running for a provincial seat as an MLA. And he said, regarding Asiatic immigration, I am an uncompromising opposition to it and will assist in every legitimate way to stem its tide and discourage its competition with white labor. And that was often the tack that they took, is that they were trying to help the white workers and preserve jobs for them. This is Chinese funeral procession on Front Street. And there was a Chinese Masonic lodge that was based in Revelstoke, and it was the Masonic lodge that did the arrangements for this funeral. We believe it was a funeral of a man named Mark Singh, who had been a wealthy Chinese merchant in Revelstoke at one time. So that this very elaborate ceremony. It was described in the newspapers. It was described in terms of being very exotic and foreign, but really quite an amazing ceremony, and everything had meaning to it. This is a very typical ad that appeared in the newspapers. This one is saying that this steam laundry employed white labor only, and don't send your hard-earned money to China. Yeah, those kinds of ads were very, very common. There was a Chinese gathering place on Front Street, was referred to as the Joss House, but since found out that that was often seen as a derogatory term. But it would have been a temple. They had shrines in there, and sort of a lodge, basically a lodge building for them. When they opened it, they had a big celebration in town and encouraged local white neighbors to come and visit and see what they were doing in the building as well, and invited them to a sumptuous dinner. I think it's similar to that, yeah. But they did have a shrine in there as well, so there was sort of a religious aspect to it as well. This actually just came my way yesterday. Granger Wilson sent me this, and it's a portion of a contract between the Provincial Ministry of Highways for the construction of the Big Eddy Bridge. And the contract was probably let around 1920. The bridge was completed in 1924. That's our beloved Big Eddy Bridge that's still there. But there's a clause in the contract that said the contractor shall not directly or indirectly employ any Asiatic upon, about, or in connection with the works. And in the event of his so doing, the minister may declare forfeited to his majesty all monies due to accrue due the contractor. They also, the clause above that says the contractor shall, in the carrying out of this contract, give preference to natural born British subjects. So, and then they made it clear that even if they weren't giving preference to British subjects, they could not hire anybody from Asia, or they would lose their contract and have to forfeit all the monies already paid to them. So that's about as blatant as it gets. And that was a government contract. Not sure how we're doing for time here.
Quarter.
Okay. I'm not going to get through that. I'll just maybe do a couple of other, get at least partway through it. So we also know that Revelstoke has a large Italian population as well. And a lot of the people came over from Italy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and were able to get jobs on the railway. So it became a really good place to come. With a lot of the ethnic groups, especially the ones who didn't speak English, if there was several people from one ethnic group settling in an area, it was natural for more of that same group to settle because it became a safe place for them. They had a community there that they could be a part of. And so you'll find places throughout British Columbia where there's pockets of different groups. So there's obviously a lot of Italians in Trail, Fernie, and Revelstoke. Kamloops became some of the larger Italian communities in the province. This was an Italian lodge that formed in 1907. And a lot of those men had come here in the early 1900s and had settled here. Now, the Italian people didn't come in for racial discrimination, but they came in for ethnic discrimination as well. So when you look at some of the newspaper articles, you'll see them being talked about in derogatory terms. There were still, they were called names other than Italian. They were, part of it was not just ethnic discrimination. There was definitely classism involved there because most of them were working class people. And so they were sort of seen as a little bit lesser than. I found out that it wasn't until after the Second World War that the CP would hire any Italians on the running trades, the conductors and engineers. So even though they could work on the railway, they were still sort of kept out of some of the higher paid and more prestigious jobs for quite some time. This was the Porta family at the corner. So it's just where the roundabout is now on the 4th Street roundabout. And this house was built by Anselmo Pratolini, who was an Italian stonemason who came over from Italy. He was brought over with a group of several other stonemasons to do some the work on the bridges in the loops area. And Anselmo Pratolini went into business for himself and became a very successful contractor. He was one of the major contractors on the courthouse, also on the buildings that are now the Taco Club and the Fine Line SUP and the Manning's building. And then the building that most people knew for years is the Pink Castle, which was his family home, an extended family home. And he is Revelstoke's only Italian mayor. He was elected in the 1930s and as mayor of Revelstoke. This was Anselmo Pratolini and his brothers and sister, because the whole family ended up coming to Revelstoke. This was Mr. Filippo Fiocco, and he was a baker and had his bakery on 4th Street East. The house is still there, where he had his bakery in behind the house. And he delivered bread for years in his horse-drawn cart. It was called South End Bakery. And his daughter was Kay Baruski. This is the Pugliese family, also known as Pugsley. I showed this last week when we were talking about Mannings, because one of the boys was Jack Pugsley, who was the candy maker at Mannings for decades. And so the original name was Pugliese, and they anglicized that to Pugsley. It was very common for people to take an English version of their names. One of the most drastic name changes I've come across was there was a man named Cristiano Fosaceca, and he ended up as Jack Matz. The story I heard about that, and the name Matz is on their cemetery marker. It's one of the 2 angels in the cemetery, and the name Matz is on there. But it says Christopher, but he went by Jack Matz for most of his life. The story that I heard about that is when he was working for the railway, he had a habit of chewing on a matchstick, and the person in charge of the pay said he wasn't even going to try to spell Cristiano Fosaceca. So he said, okay, you're Jack Match. And so he decided to use that name, but spelled it M-A-T-Z. And it shows up on like baptismal records in the Catholic Church register. It's the name on their headstone, but it was probably never a formal name change, but people did that all the time. I think most families, if they came from anywhere other than England, you're going to find a name change story somewhere in the family. This was the Lonzo farm at the top of on Arrow Heights, Airport Way. So from this photograph, Dickel Road would just be over in this area. And a lot of you will probably still remember the farmhouse and the A-frame barn. The Lonzo family, Mr. Lonzo had come over from Italy and was working in Donald, BC for the railway. And his fellow worker was Dominic Galaco, and Dominic Galaco was going back to Italy to bring over his wife. And Mr. Lonzo said, can you bring me back a wife too? And he brought back, I think, a young cousin. And I think the cousin was about, she was still a teenager, and Mr. Fiocco was well into his 30s. But they got married, raised a big family there, and the family was still there until not that long ago. So here's Mrs. Lonzo in her later years with one of her grandchildren. And the A-frame barn was built as they had a community barn raising in 1916. This is members of the Lonzo family. I mentioned the Gallicano family. So Dominic Gallicano also would been working in Donald and then came here, and he decided to go into business. So he opened built the store on Mackenzie Avenue that is now the modern. No, wait a minute, sorry. He built the one that was most recently Malone's. Built that as his as an Italian store and bakery, and then later built his bakery on 2nd Street East. The building is still there at the very end of 2nd Street, and raised his family there, and had his new bakery, which he called a sanitary bakery, because most bakeries were not sanitary, because they had like wooden floors and wooden counters, and he had a terrazzo floor and marble counters, so that you wouldn't get the flour and grease that would attract bugs and mice. next to the water store. So the Spice of Life and Moondilly, that's the building that they're in. And then on the corner, they had another building that was known as the Superior Grocery Store. And that was later taken over by Mr. Baruski, one of the Baruski family. And that was there until they were widening Victoria Road, and it was torn down. This was, you can see, so the Gallicano family started Salian Bread, Salian Bakery, and then they also had Salian Restaurant. And Salian Bread was sold in Revelstoke until the 1980s out of that location. There's also an Italian band that was here, the Verity Band, after Giuseppe Verdi, the famous Italian composer. And we actually have some instruments in our collection that came from the Verity Band. This is a photograph that was taken at Comlex, which was sort of around the corner from Arrowhead on the northeast arm of the Upper Arrow Lake. And there was a large sawmill that operated there until it was burned down in 1915. This photograph was taken around 1910, 1911. And you can see that there's a diverse workforce there. There's several South Asians there who are Sikh workers. There's several Japanese workers there and several Caucasian workers as well. And a lot of the mills that were sprung up in the area, they did have these workforces from different countries, but they always housed the different groups separately. So they had housing for the South Asian workers, they had separate housing for the Japanese workers, and then housing for the Caucasian workers, or the Caucasian workers could live wherever they wanted, basically. But the other races were kept sort of, or the other groups were kept in sort of separate designated housing. I've actually seen a paybook from the mill at Three Valley, the Mundy Lumber Company mill there, and it didn't name any of the Japanese or South Asian workers, just referred to them as by their ethnic origin, number one, number two, number three. And the Sikh workers, they referred to them as Hindus, which was not even the right religion, but that's how they were known. I've talked before about Jenny Kahara, and this is her rebuilt marker in the Revelstoke Cemetery. For years, the base of the marker was eroding, and this was just recently replaced. So it's quite beautiful if you go up. But Jenny was a Japanese prostitute who we know she was in Revelstoke as early as 1903 and was murdered in her home in 1905. And in the newspaper accounts at the time of her death, it said that the police were not able to get any information from the other Japanese people in the neighborhood, and said that they didn't think that she was worth hanging a man for, so they wouldn't give any information. So there's, as I say, I've talked about her story before, so I won't go into depth right now. It was through Arts Revelstoke. There was a project, and there was, I think there was also some funding from the through Okanagan College. It was specific for that too. So of course we know on March 4th, 1910, there was the tremendous snowslide in Rogers Pass, and 58 men died in that, and 32 of them were Japanese. And when they did the memorial service in town, they listed the names of the Caucasians who died, and then separately listed the names of the Japanese men who died. The Japanese men were all sent to Vancouver for burial, and they had Buddhist ceremonies at the in Vancouver, and they're all buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. There's a picture of the funeral procession in Vancouver for, I think there's there's several of the men here. You can see several hearses there because they were buried several at one time, based on how many bodies they transported at a time. Now, one of the things we've been discovering recently, and I talked about this in a talk earlier this year, is that there were a lot more Japanese settlers here before World War II than we realized. One of the families that was here was the Hashimoto family, and they initially, and his wife was with him. They initially were living sort of on box cars or housing cars along the railway siding, and then they later moved into town and had a house, built a house on Humbert Street. That's your house, yeah. That was the Hashimoto house, and they were, they were an established family here. There were several others. There was the Takahashi family who also lived here before the war as well. Often they would go back and forth to Japan as well. So some of the children in the family were educated more in Japan than they were in Canada. But we know that there was a more sizable Japanese community here than we realized. And then, of course, during after the attack on Pearl Harbor and war was declared against Japan, all Japanese people, regardless of where they had been born, were removed from the coast, and a lot of them ended up in camps. In a lot of them in the Slocan Valley, Kaslo, Sandon, in that area. But there were several families that were able to come independently to this area. But the city council would not allow any Japanese people to live inside the city limits. At that time, though, the city boundary was Downey Street. So the south end of Downey Street and south of that was not in city limits, and Big Eddy was not in the city limits. So a lot of the evacuees were able to settle in like at the end of Downey Street. So the Wakita family settled at the end of Downey Street. They had a big strawberry farm down there. This is Mr. and Mrs. Wakita, and two of their two youngest daughters, Mas and Yai. And a lot of people will know Yai as Yai Hayashi and Mas Ora. Mrs. Ora is still alive. She's about 98 or 99. And of course, they had a big strawberry farm there. It wasn't until about 2 years after the war that Japanese people were allowed to purchase property inside the city limits and open businesses in the city. And even then, they were members of the Legion who were appearing in front of city council saying, we do not want Japanese businesses in our town. But the city didn't listen to them. They did allow them to establish. So the Wakita family, they had a store. Originally, they bought the Bregalisi store where the Brewski Park is now. And then they opened frozen food lockers where the new building is next to the old red and white store. And then they opened the red and white store. So they were really involved in the business life of the community. Also have minutes from the local golf club. In 1942, they passed a resolution that no Japanese people would be allowed to play on the Revelstoke golf course. And in 1947, some people in the club tried to get that overturned, but there were still enough members that wanted that restriction in place. So it wasn't until 1949 that members of there was a local Japanese Canadian Citizens Association, and they again petitioned the courthouse to allow Japanese players to play on the golf course. And finally, they rescinded that. But there were still some people on the board of the golf club who wanted to keep that restriction in place. But so that was until 1949. This was a family, the Tsuchiya family and Amada family, who were settled in Big Eddy. And then, of course, there weren't family camps in this area, but there were men's work camps between here and Sicamous. So there were men who were basically forced into labor they were doing some improvements to the road between here and Sycamoose. So they had a lot of people who were men who were interned there. A lot of them were young men who were born in Canada and spoke perfect English, had been going to a lot of them had graduated from high school, had gone into university, and they were forced into these work camps. So there were camps at Three Valley, Taft, Yard Creek, Salsqua, all through that area, Griffin Lake. And this was, we actually have quite a few photographs that came from some of the people who had been in the camps. They were allowed to come to Revelstoke sort of once a week and go to then they said that the group that ended up having Saturday as their day was really lucky because they could go to see a movie. And so all the other camps that got different days were jealous of the group that got to come into town on Saturday. Of course, there was a large Scandinavian community here as well. Going back to 1885, there was the Abrahamsons and the Stromdahl families. The Stromdahl family changed their name to Stone. But C.F. Lindemark, Charles Holton, they were all most of those were people from Sweden who had come over here. And it's really that population that was responsible for the ski culture that grew up in Revelstoke, started in Revelstoke. Of course, the famous skier Nils Nelson came over as a teenager with his family from Norway. His father was Norwegian, his mother was Swedish, but was born in Norway. And of course, he became the champion skier in this area. And this was a man named Ole Westerberg, Westerberg Road. And he was also a Swedish immigrant. And he ended up being the mail carrier in the Big Bend for over 40 years. And there's lots of, I think I've done a talk just on him before because he was quite the character. He was called Ole the Bear for a few reasons. This is the Abrahamsons Hotel on Front Street, the Central Hotel. It got even bigger than this. This was their second version. We actually have a Scandinavian Aid and Fellowship Society ledger in our archives. It is in Swedish, but it tells us sort of what some of the occupations were. A lot of them were working in the forest industry, and then a lot of the others were businessmen as well. There's Nels Nelson and his sister Elise, who is the great-grandmother of my new grandson. And this is members of the Nelson and Gunnerson families. And it was, there'd been skiing in Revelstoke as early as the 1890s, and it was introduced by a Swedish miner from Albert Canyon. That's sort of Ole Sandberg is credited as the first person to use skis in the area. But with a lot of new immigration from Sweden and Norway in the about 1912 to 1914, that's when they started the formal ski club, and that's what started when they opened the ski jump, worked with Parks Canada to have the ski jump on there. So they're really responsible for that upsurge of skiing in Revelstoke. The members of the Nelson and there's also a Hooley in there and Johnson. They're doing a three-legged skiing race. Pretty cute picture. I'm probably over my 1 hour, aren't I?
Quite.
You didn't start the photograph.
Do you want me to keep going? Okay, we'll go. This is a picture of some of the extended Nelson, Johnson, Gunnerson families in Big Eddy. That's where a lot of them settled as well. At that time, there was actually a mill in Big Eddy as well, so a lot of them were settling there. Now, we'll talk a little bit now about the Ukrainian community. And there were some settlers who came into the area around 1907, 1908. It was Stanislaus Kolchiski and Damien Hulid. And they were able to get some land south of town, 6 to 8 miles south of town, and then let other people know from their villages that there was land available here. So by 1920, there was probably over 100 people, mostly from Ukraine, a few from Poland, because the borders were kind of pretty fluid back then, but a lot of settlers from Ukraine came and settled at Mount Cartier. And it was called the Mount Cartier settlement because it's at the base of Mount Cartier. So that's where the name came from. So it became quite a built up settlement. This was a barn raising on the Shura farm in about 1915 or so. So they would all gather and build farms for help each other build their farms. This was the Ozero family. Of course, there's still Ozeros in town now. And there was Mr. and Mrs. Ozero and their sons and daughters and the wives and husbands of their sons and daughters. And then one of the sons, James, was the postmaster at Mount Cartier for many years. And he actually kept a daily diary. So we'd have the weather that day. We'd have anytime there was a baby born in the community or a marriage. Also the price of eggs that they were selling or cream that they were selling. We also have records from the Muka family, and John Muka had a cream route. So he would go and gather the cream from a lot of the farms in Mount Cartier and take it into Revelstoke and to be sold. So it was an additional income for the people who were living down there. A lot of the men worked in other jobs. They worked in the forest industry or for highways or the railway, and the wives and children were doing a lot of the farm work. But it was kind of a self-sustaining community. They had a school. This was a Green Slide School. It was a little bit south of Mount Cartier. They did have a school right at Mount Cartier for a while. Ken's grandmother, Mrs. English, Irene English, taught there for a while. And they had their own church, a little community hall. So quite a vibrant community. This is showing sort of the Montana Creek area down south. And again, the Montana Creek, Montana Slough area. This is the Shaleski family, Walter and Daisy Shaleski and Walter's mother. So everybody was involved in the farming. We also have some records from the Farmers Institute that have a list of, and I think they were done in about the 1940s, and they were doing a survey on what farms had pigs and if the farms wanted more pigs. So on that survey form, it asked them how many acres they had, how much was planted, what crops they were planting, what other animals they had. So it's a really good way of sort of seeing just how much agricultural activity was taking place in that community. And of course, there was a lot of logging going on as well. That's what the Kozak family started their logging as a little portable mill down in the 12-mile Mount Cartier, south of Mount Cartier. And of course, the Kozak mill is still in operation today. They started with that little portable mill from the older members of the family back in the 1940s. This was Walter Shaleski. And Walter and Richard Kamosi and Sam Olenek were the people who started Downey Street sawmills. There's the three of them there. There's Richard Kamosi, Walter Shaleski, and Sam Olenek. And Walter died in a logging accident. So the other two partners carried on with the company after that. And this was one of the community halls down at Mount Cartier. They had a band, they had and a choir. This was a performance that they did at the YMCA in the 1940s. So we've got photographs of these men doing like a Russian style or Eastern European style dance where they get way down low and kick their legs out. This was the children's band as well. And we do have the names of most of the people in these photographs. This was the Gaiac farm. The Gaiac family still owns property in that area, but they had to sell sort of the low-lying property. Well, of course, we know that most of the Mount Cartier settlement had to be bought up at the time that the dam was being built at Castlegar, the Hugh Keenley side dam. It's 150 miles south of here, but it created the Arrow Lakes Reservoir all the way up to Revelstoke and flooded out most of what was the Mount Cartier community. So it displaced all of that farming activity, all of that community. This was a picture probably from about 1950 showing some of the farms in Mount Cartier, and you can see back in here the little white building, that was their St. Anne's Church. So there was actually, for a short period of time, there was an internment camp on Mount Revelstoke during World War I. And the internment program during World War I was for people who were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany. But there were not very many Germans put in those camps. The majority of the people who were put in the camps were Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans who just happened to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was their current oppressor. But there were a lot of reasons behind that, and a lot of the reasons for that, the internment of Ukrainian people was economic. There was Canada had encouraged immigration from Eastern Europe, so to populate the prairies and work farms, create farms in the area, do manual labor throughout the country. But then just before World War I, the country had gone into a bit of a recession. So we ended up with all these surplus men. So that internment program was actually seen as a way to contain those people. So there was a huge economic factor behind that internment program. The camp on Mount Revelstoke, I mean, the timing and location were pretty poor. They opened in September of 1915, and guess what happens on Mount Revelstoke in the fall? So they were spending they were supposed to be working on the road to the summit, but they spent most of their time cutting wood and shoveling snow. So it only lasted for a couple of months, and then they were moved to other camps in Vernon and Yoho. No, this is a very rare and unusual photograph. This is the McKinnon's pool hall and cigar store. That's where the 11 Hotel is and the Quartermaster restaurant. And it's the only photograph that we have showing a Black man. And the information that we have was that he was running the shoe shine in the pool hall. So these chairs here are for a shoe shine stand. We don't know his name. There wasn't very many Black people here. We know that there were some who were here in the very early days during construction, but they moved on quickly. I've seen a few little notes in the early police book from about 1907, 1910. There was one note in there where it said that somebody had reported his watch missing. So what they did was they rounded up all the Black men who were in town and searched them. They couldn't find the watch, but they put them all on the train and sent them out of town. So it wasn't welcoming or safe for them. So that's why there wasn't a Black community that settled here. There was also South Asians that were in this area. As I mentioned, a lot of them were working in the sawmills. When the 1910 Rogers Pass snowslide happened, there was a big crew of South Asian workers that were hired in the rescue efforts to recover bodies. We actually have in the records of that event, we have a letter written by the head of the Sikh crew, and he's talking about how badly they're being treated, and said that they were just trying to help. They were so upset that all these men had died, and they wanted to help the company. Said it's a bad time for the railway. It's a bad time for everybody, and we wanted to help. But he said his men were being kicked and abused and called names, and he said that he wanted that addressed. He said the roadmaster was treating them really poorly, and so that's a document that we have in our records. This photograph was taken at Three Valley, where the Mundy Lumber Company mill was located, and it came from the Housen family records. The Housen family was involved with the Mundy Lumber Company to a certain extent. And these photographs were taken, there was three photographs taken at the same time. And one of the workers had died, and their other fellow workers were actually doing a cremation of their worker. Cremation was not really known in Western Canada at that time. It was seen as a real foreign practice. It definitely wasn't mainstream. So I've actually seen accounts in the newspaper describing cremations by some of the Sikh community that were in the area. So that this was part of the cremation ceremony that they had. So it's a big topic. You know, I've really just scratched the surface here. Definitely wanted to talk about racism, but I also wanted to talk about, you know, just how incredible some of the early settlers of this area were, even though they had a lot of barriers. They created the community that we have now. Of course, it was certainly a more diverse community than we were back in the early 1900s. So it's just good to be able to celebrate who we are as a community and to celebrate the diversity that we have. So another talk in 2 weeks is going to be on Revelstoke during the World Wars, just coming up to Remembrance Day. And then we've started our Film Friday series, and the next one is next Friday, and we're showing the film Revelstoke, A Kiss in the Wind. And that's just a lovely story from an Italian filmmaker who discovered that his great-grandfather had died in the construction of the Connaught Tunnel in 1915, and came to explore that story and find out what had happened to his grandfather. His great-grandfather had left a wife and baby back in Italy, and he would sign all his letters, "I send you a kiss in the wind." So that became the title of the film. So we'll be watching that one next week. So thanks for coming, and see you again soon.